Hey YouTube. Welcome to hashtag HealMeToo at home with insights, art, and activism to meet the needs of now. I'm Hope Singson, the artist, activist, survivor, and founder of the HealMeToo Festival and podcast. If you're listening on Apple or any podcast, you might want to hop on over to YouTube. Look up the HealMeToo podcast and festival channel to watch this video and every recent episode. A quick note about today. We won't focus on any graphic details, but I do encourage you to take a break or skip ahead if you need at any time. And you can find a list of support resources at HealMeTooPodcast.com. At live HealMeToo events, we always start with community agreements, and I've started sharing one of them called Ouch, Oops, Oh at the top of every episode for the rest of season 3. Because I am a white, cis, queer, middle-class interviewer, passionately working for social justice as an activist and through the HealMeToo platform, but I make mistakes. So if I say or do anything that causes discomfort or hurt or just ouch, I really do hope that podcast listeners and my guests will feel invited to let me know, ouch, so I can say oops, and then listen in the spirit of oh to do better. During the HealMeToo at Home series, we are at home, so the Wi-Fi in Zoom can be imperfect sometimes at times. If any of us today have weak Wi-Fi, we may turn off our cameras so the audio will be stronger, and then come back on camera when we can. But here's to smooth sailing. Because I'm really, really looking forward to this episode. We're changing things up in an exciting way with a hashtag Keep Sharing the Mic conversation. Back in June, 4 badass women and Instagram luminaries founded the hashtag Share the Mic Now campaign. Bozoma St. John, Levy Ajayi Jones, Glennon Doyle, and Stacey Bendett worked together to center Black women's voices on white women's platforms. As they wrote, when the world listens to women, it listens to white women. For far too long, Black women's voices have gone unheard, even though they've been using their voices loudly for centuries to enact change. Today, more than ever, it is necessary that we create a unifying action to center Black women's lives, stories, and calls to action. We need to listen to Black women. And later, they invited all of us to keep sharing the mic. They wrote, "This campaign was born out of relationships. We invite other Black and white women in relationships to recreate this action in their own spaces." So today, I am really honored and excited to welcome 2 women I'm delighted to be in relationship and community with, Jovan Martinez and Cassity Yeye, who graced the stage at a HealMeToo Festival pop-up event earlier this year, A Love Thing, recorded for season 2 of the podcast. Jovan's beautiful lead singing actually graces the opening and closing credits of every episode of season 3, sampling the whispers. And I'm so grateful that Jovan and Cassity, you each said yes when I asked if you'd consider coming on this platform to have a conversation about your work, about the intersections of so many types of stress and trauma at all times, and especially right now for survivors of color, about how you're managing in 2020, and what wisdom you may want to share about how to heal. So first, let me just say welcome to Jovan and Cassity.
Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's a delight. So now let me just tell people a little your bios. You're both really amazing people. Jovan Martinez is a writer, poet, spoken word artist, activist, and motivational speaker who for over 10 years has been a part of the Relationship Abuse Prevention Program, or RAP, a program of steps to end family violence. She seeks to empower youth through music and poetry. Currently, she works as an early rap community educator, teaching students about healthy relationship and consent culture. Cassity Yeye is a 24-year-old born and raised in Brooklyn, a community educator with early rap. She's currently working on her MSW in social work and running a blog, and working on her certification in yoga and social emotional facilitation. So, again, I'm really grateful to you both for your interest in having this conversation, and also for your interest in having me be present. I did offer, to both of you, would you like to just have a conversation on the platform and I will just be the technical support, or, how would you like to do this? Maybe we can start. I want to hand you the mic. Actually, let me just hand you the mic. Would you like to tell people about the work you do with early rap, or pick up with this idea of share the mic, and what made you interested in this invitation?
Can we do both?
Yes,
Is
please.
both an option? All right.
This is your conversation.
Cool. Jovan, if I miss anything, feel free. Early
I
rap
got you.
is, so the rap program, Relationship Abuse Prevention, was originally aimed at high school students. So being part education and part clinical, by being able to serve high school students in the city with access and providing the ability to have a person to speak to be counseled, to counsel them, as well as the education portion of fostering healthy relationships and learning about what unhealthy relationships look like, what healthy relationships look and feel like. And basically, we wanted to transfer that over to middle schoolers, and understanding that younger people have the ability to unlearn things a lot better than adults do. And so when we think about what society teaches us as we get older about our relationships and interpersonal communication, early rap is really built to get at younger students, to help them foster those relationships, as well as undoing rape culture and kind of fostering consent culture in spaces, as well as working with their communities as a whole. So working with their teachers and their parents, so that the message is not just one being told to students, but also to the people that spend a lot of time with them, and being able to foster that message as well.
That's super
Giovanna.
smart. Do you want to add to that, Jovan?
Yeah, so I think when I learned about the early rap program, after being in the rap program since I was 16, I thought, what an amazing opportunity for middle schoolers, because one of the mottos that I live by is be the person that you needed at whatever point in your life, right? And so at this point, we're talking about middle schoolers. And so when I go into classrooms, I try to be the person that that I would need as a middle schooler, right? And I try to have these conversations and create these spaces where middle schoolers can talk about things like consent and healthy relationships and sexual harassment. And I think that's so important, because a lot of times we try to create these spaces and we call them safe spaces. But I think here at Early Rap, we've transitioned from calling things safe spaces and calling them brave spaces, right? And so you might not always feel safe in a space to talk or share your story, but with confidentiality, with allowing people to just be themselves in the room, we hope that you feel brave enough to share your story. And so early rap is just so important for middle schoolers, because a lot of times, especially in the schools that I work with, they're underserved and they don't have the resources where they can speak and share their story and share the mic.
I was thinking that too. I was thinking, wow, what a great segue to the share the mic idea, because you're almost talking about part of the systemic racism that prohibits the culture from hearing more voices of color. But let me hand the mic back to you both about what do you think about this idea of share the mic, and is it important, and um, what if anything appealed to you and come into a conversation like this?
I take a deep sigh because it feels like a really layered answer. I think sharing the mic is important if you're a young Black girl watching television and you don't see someone who looks like you. If you're a young person of color and you want to be a journalist, but you never hear people who look like you or sound like you or come from where you come from. If you're a student in a classroom, but you've never had a teacher that sounds or looks like you or knows where you come from, in order to relate. when we think about advocating and who the faces of advocacy are. And you think about what resources folks get or don't get as a basis of what that advocacy looks like or sounds like, it can speak to a lot of folks not even realizing that certain injustices are happening, that people are having experiences that are violent or oppressive, and not only not being recognized, but it also not being validated. So I think when we talk about sharing the mic, it's expanding the idea kind of either what we already know or things we've never known about before, and being able to allow the people we talk about to tell their own story. I think folks of color and Black people have had their stories told for them over time, whether that's been through education or through policy or through, slavery or, whichever topic we want to pick from the hat of isms. But I think it's important to allow folks to tell.
I've never heard that before. The hat of isms. I'm going to keep that. Sorry to
You're
interrupt.
fine.
I just had to appreciate that.
There are so many of them, so depending on which one you want to take a look at, it definitely gives people the opportunity to not only give the vantage point of a person of color or Black people, but also to recognize that every person of color, Black person's experience is not going to be the same. And so being able to highlight, like you've mentioned before, just those intersections and what that looks like on different people of different ages, different ethnicities, different races, different abilities. So being able to open up that conversation allows it to not be so one-dimensional.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Cassidy has said. And I think just to add to, right, thinking about the title of Share the Mic, right? It's not take the mic, it's not your mic, but we're sharing the mic. And I think that's so important because everyone has a story and everyone deserves a chance to share that story. And sometimes, I know one of my community agreements, and Hope you had spoke about community agreements, right, is like we talk about flow in and flow out. And that's really for us talkers, right? People like me, I love to talk. And I think sometimes it's important to say, okay, I've said what I needed to say, and now let me listen. And I think sharing the mic is also about listening, listening to other people's stories and learning to actively listen, right? Not just being like, oh yeah, what you said was great, and now let me tell you about me. But more so like, I hear you, I'm validating what you're saying, and everything that you're saying is very important. And that's what share the mic means.
God, I love that. I love that. Thank you. Well, let's, if you would like to go there next, I'm wondering if we should level set for people who may not be as aware of what compound trauma is or what the intersecting harms are that Black and brown people, communities of color. I would like to center Black voices right now as the Share the Mic campaign asks us to do. So if we want to just unpack a little bit what we mean when we talk about intersecting. I mean, we've already alluded to a couple. Zip.
There are a lot of questions in there. So I'm going to tackle intersections first. Does that feel safe, fair? So for folks like who don't know what intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, awesome woman, still great, who essentially, do I tell the whole story? I guess I can tell the whole story really quickly. There was a Black woman who worked at a car company or wanted to work at a company, and she applied for a job but couldn't get the job because she either had to apply as Black essentially or as a woman, not both. And we live in a world where there are folks who constantly are met in the middle of those intersections. So being Black and dealing with racism, being a woman and dealing with sexism and patriarchy, if you are a Black woman who is part of the LGBTQ community and dealing with heterosexism, there are several intersections that folks can meet in the middle of, and being able to have conversations that not just explain what intersectionalities are, but also look at how those different intersections work together or don't work together oftentimes in our society is essentially what intersectionality really is all about, or at least being able to recognize intersectionality when talking about things like complex trauma and how that might affect different people. Yeah. And the second question, if you wanted to say that one more time.
Well, I think maybe if we could explain what complex trauma is, and for one of the realities of privilege is, most people have some kind of privilege, but people who have a lot of privilege, aka white people especially, and it's whatever it's all the gradations, all the identities, white people with a lot of money, with families with a lot of, like, la la la. But anyway, it's very easy, and I wish I had looked this up ahead of time. There's a political science theorist who observed, I remember learning in college, so that was a while ago, and I've forgotten who it was. Apologies. I'll try to put it in the liner notes of the episode. But the observation that when you've got power, it's very easy not to know about the circumstances of those with less power. And so there's this, as you just described in different words, there's this dynamic where white people don't really, and it's what we're talking about with Share the Mic, not hearing the stories or not hearing them from the people experiencing it, not knowing. So because of that, I just wanted to maybe unpack a little, like, systemic racism, or the economic impacts of what we're seeing right now with COVID and the health impacts. And as we headed into the pandemic, I was like already really floored by what communities of color were having to go through, that it became quickly apparent, although everybody gets sick, the numbers are so much worse, so much better in more privileged communities because of health outcomes. So anyway, again, zip, but maybe complex trauma or some of these, describing a little bit the layers of,
Yeah. So, I mean, layer wise, when you think about disparities and coronavirus, I think it's not just about white privileged folks that might have better health insurance. It's access to health insurance. These are probably folks who might have better jobs, that might give them access to certain things. But we also think about folks of color predominantly being essential workers. So when you think about your nurses and who works in your grocery stores and who works to pick up your trash and all of the things that we kind of need to go on consistently, we don't think about the folks that are actually behind those counters. And a lot of those folks are Black people and folks of color. Those are the people that are constantly out there putting their lives and their families at risk. So when you think about numbers increasing in brown and Black communities, definitely most likely having to attribute to the fact that these are the people who are on the front lines. When we think about where folks are situated, and what social distancing might look like in certain places, or how social distancing has been policed in certain spaces, where we've seen white folks who might not have been so compliant with social distancing rules, we were handed masks. When we think about folks of color, Black people who weren't either able to or just didn't have access to masks, maybe they couldn't afford them, have them, because definitely in the beginning of this thing, getting access to Lysol and, just regular cleaning supplies and toilet paper, for crying out loud, was
in New York.
Well, yeah, especially. So it was, when you think about who is able to access those things, if you're at work all day, when do you have time to grocery shop versus being able to be at home with your family because your job is paying you to stay at home anyway? So again, with the intersections, there are several things that have contributed to numbers. And when you ask about complex trauma or compound trauma, which is really, I don't know if folks are familiar with that terminology, but complex trauma is exposure to multiple traumatic events, often in an invasive and interpersonal nature. So this might look really different from acute trauma, which happens from like a single event, like a car accident or a natural disaster, versus chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged in certain situations. So when we think about complex trauma, that might look a lot different in different communities and what folks are up against. Granted, everyone experiences trauma, despite how we might feel, react, or cope with it. But complex trauma definitely falls on folks differently, especially when we think about what kind of help they have access to when it comes to dealing with complex or compound trauma.
Yeah, and I think too, if you just think about the word complex in itself, I think that kind of helps you to understand that there's a lot going on. And Cassity really did a great job of explaining it in detail. But it's so much going on that it's complex, right? And thinking about like a Rubik's Cube, and how complex that can be and how many parts there are. And those parts are constantly moving and changing, and it takes time. And even sometimes when you think you figured it out, there's another layer that comes, and you have to try to figure that part out. And yeah, I think it's because of so many different traumatic events that sometimes start as early as childhood, right? And so if we think about COVID and we think about the opening of schools now and how underserved communities will see disparities in their schools. And we'll see that, you know, schools in privileged communities will have more access to probably hand sanitizer and Lysol wipes, and teachers not having, I know one of my schools, one math teacher will have to teach for every single grade. And thinking about how hard that's going to be. And thinking about what these kids have been going through since March, when COVID really hit us hard, and they've been at home where it sometimes isn't safe, and now coming back into the schools and having to unpack all of that and not having resources. And right there, it's that complex trauma, right? There's so much that has happened. There's so much that is happening. And how do we work through that? And if you don't have the right resources and the right support in these areas, then what do we do? And I think that's why complex trauma is so important, because there's so many, it's your families, it's the communities, it's the school, it's everything that's happening all at one time for a person. And it's really important to think about all of those things and not say, well, you're not doing good because you just don't want to, but really thinking about what is happening that's causing you to not flourish and succeed the way that you need to, and what systems are preventing that to happen.
You're muted, Hope.
I got so like wrapped up listening, which is, you know, so that's good. I was sharing the mic. Um, but yeah, I think I was just thinking about economic stress. You know, poverty has been researched as a form of psychological trauma, like the constant stress that, you know, you're describing if you don't have access to what you need. Um,
And it's a
isn't
cycle when you think about, and a lot of this has come up in the news, but for a lot of parents, they need their kids in school so that they can go to work, you know? So having childcare, it's like, do I focus on feeding my family, or do I focus on keeping my child home and keeping my child safe? Either way, my child is not getting what they need out of, you know, entirely what they need out of that situation. And so even that in and of itself is complex to
Mhm.
manage. You know, do I put myself in harm's way by going to work or doing what I need to do and bringing that back home? Do I send my child to school? Because frankly, being at home is hard for especially younger students, you know, being at home and not with their friends, not in their normal schedule. That change in and of itself is traumatic, as quickly as it happened and as quickly as it's being undone. Having to manage that as well. So I think they all tie in together, you know, when we think about students who have to go to school because that's where they get food to eat. When we think about economic problems at large and just in New York, when we think about how segregated our school communities and our school districts are, those kids might have to go to school because that's where they get food. That's where they get some semblance of interaction with other folks, where they get a place maybe to shower, depending on what the resources at that school look like. And that's if they have those resources, you know? So I think that economic disparity can either be really small when you look at it or really huge, like on a macro level, depending on where you're staring at it from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I just want to acknowledge that it's, you know, a continuing domino straight back to slavery. Just to say it, you know, it's like the generations of wealth and well-being and injustice is another form of compounding. You talk about compound interest, and this is another. I probably shouldn't even be. This is why I initially was like, should I even be part of this? Because I have thoughts, but you know, this isn't my conversation. This isn't my. This is certainly not my experience, but this is something I observe and recognize, and just wanted to acknowledge. Do you want to just sort of work in the intensification throughout this same period around police brutality, the lynchings, and the Black Lives Matter movement and protests? I mean, it's like, I know I'm still looking at your face, Cassity. It's just, it's too much.
I mean, I'll be transparent about it. Being an educator and I remember that Friday on March 13th was the last day out. And on Monday, everything was just different. Like, there was nowhere to go. Schedules were changed, staying home. And even that had me thinking about like folks who are incarcerated. I've never had that experience. There are tons of folks who've never had that experience, but for so many people, being home and being in this one space was probably the most difficult thing that I had to do for some time. Like, not moving, not having a regular schedule, and then to be home and everything be so centered around this wonderful computer invention thing. And seeing coronavirus news and police brutality that's like gone up, especially in the realm of like social distancing and whatnot. And then to see news about lynchings come up, and then to see Trump just being Trump, you know, like it was like balancing being informed versus being entirely overwhelmed and inundated with information, while still also having to work and maintain some kind of like normalcy for students who were trying to sit at a computer and learn all day, even though they weren't even half tapped in, you know. So speaking for myself, I don't want to speak for all of the wonderful women, Jovan, in the room. Just understanding that, like, I'm still managing, you know. Police brutality has been a part of my life since I was 3. You know, it's not new. When I think about Amadou Diallo, when that happened when I was 3 years old, and I don't really remember that. When I think about Sean Bell, I think I was like 10 in elementary school when Sean Bell happened. So this isn't new. You know, I think for a lot of folks, I think it's just in your face. And you can't not see it. You can't not say that it's not happening, or once in a while, or only in bad neighborhoods. Or so I think it's just, if anything, it's a matter of just dealing with how obvious it is now. You know, granted, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling, there are folks who live in communities where the obvious is normal, where they see obvious forms of racism, or again, all of the isms happening all at once, all the time. And I've had the luxury of having some of these isms be, I don't want to say invisible, but definitely living in New York, more interesting to look for, or that comes out a lot differently in certain spaces. And so just kind of having to recognize the fact that this is real and this is happening all at the same time. And it's not going to change overnight. So what can I do for myself as a Black woman to find some kind of, joy as a form of revolution, some kind of peace as a form, or even napping as a form of revolution. Shout out to the nap ministry. They're amazing. But I think that's a matter for me, at least, is knowing that this is not something that's going to change overnight. Whether we talk about all of the things that are happening to the trans community, the Black trans community, when we think about things that are happening to children of color, folks of color, whether that be via immigration or here on our soil not having clean water, these are not overnight solutions. And so I think the most powerful thing I've been able to do for myself in this time is try to find a way to make it through. Try to find a way to balance out the information I'm taking in and not spending so much time on social media at the same time. That was a lot, but yes.
Thank you. No, thank you.
I think for me, and Cassity again has said so many points that I'm like, yeah. It's really tricky because for me, this has been something that I've been seeing my whole life. Once I was at an age where I could understand what was going on, it became a part of my life. I remember when Trayvon Martin was killed, I got so engulfed in protesting and fighting trolls who were just on Facebook. They didn't have anything to say. They just wanted to attack people and make people upset. That I had to take a break and I really had to rest, and I had to say, this is taking over my whole life. And I think it's so complex because it is my life, right? So it's like, do I take a break from everything that's going on to take care of myself, or do I continue to fight for the people that represent me? And I think with everything that's going on with police brutality, this isn't anything new. This is something that's been going on for centuries, decades, slavery, forever. I think right now we're seeing like a repeat of the 60s. And I think it's so important that what we do as millennials, and I consider myself an older head, even though I'm not. But I think it's important what we do right now is going to really impact the next generation and show them how we are as a people. And so I think it's important too for anyone who's out there protesting or, sharing and hashtagging all these things to understand that this is not a trend. This is not something that we're just doing because it's COVID and we don't have anything else to do right now. But these are people's lives. And it's so important to take this serious right now, because if we don't, then we don't know what will happen. And I think the media coverage has died down, and people are still fighting to keep the Black Lives Matter movement going. And I think we don't even need media coverage for this kind of stuff. If this is truly our lives and this is what we're fighting for, then we need to continue to be in our communities like early rap, and we need to continue to be teaching and educating our youth on topics of police brutality, on topics of, voting and just things that are so important and crucial right now for our time. And so I know I'm rambling too at this point, but I think it's we're in such a crucial time that it's not time to do things for hashtags or do things for likes. And I am speaking mainly to my millennials. This is not a time to try to gain followers. This is a time to support your community and to really, if you're for it. If you're not, we understand and we will move on without you, right? Because the last thing we want is anyone supporting something that they don't actually support and they're only doing it just cause. And so I feel like, and I see your head shake.
Well, I mean, how could you not support it? But yeah, I mean, you're right, of course.
Yeah, there are people that don't support it, right? And whatever. But we're not focused on the people who don't support it. We need to we need to focus on the people who do. And so right now, if you are really being supportive and, police brutality and these protests you're out there doing and you're fighting the fight, then we appreciate you and we need you. And that's what's important right now. And stay true to what it is that you're actually trying to do. Don't get caught up in the media. Don't get caught up in what society might be trying to paint this picture of, but we understand what it is that we're doing and how important Black lives are. And I know I'm one person, and I can say, I'm like, Black lives matter. I don't have to tell anybody that my life matters. That's the kind of stance that I come from. I come from, I know my life matters. You should know my life matters. So why am I out here saying that to you? And how important that is in itself. So for just to all my protesters listening and all my Black and brown people, keep fighting, keep doing what you're doing. The kids need you. The elders need you. We all need you, and we're here.
I would like to add to that, though, that it's important to find your place in the midst of all this. Not everybody's a protester. Not everybody is built to be out on the street. Not everybody is built to be in a classroom. Not everybody is built to run a podcast. Not everybody is built to be an educator. And so whether that looks like art activism, whether that looks like music, whether that looks like educating, whether that looks like being out on the street, writing things out, providing resources and putting those out for folks. There have been tons of beautiful communities doing community fridges for folks that haven't had access to buying their own food. So I think when folks think about their place, in the revolution and what is going on, if social media is your thing, I think it's important to use that to your ability. If you've got a following and you feel like you can do something productive with that, with those people, even if that is just educating folks, do that, because not everybody is able to be in a certain space or take up space, I should say, in a certain way, but also not everybody receives information the same way. So somebody might feel more inclined to be supportive because they saw a painting that was really awesome and that spoke to them and helped them understand things more deeper. If that was poetry or journaling or yoga or a form of resting. I just think that change at this point looks very different for different people, and acknowledging that even within our own, community as Black and brown folks, dealing with these things, or even having to educate people within our own communities about what's going on, it looks very different from other folks. So being able to acknowledge that, like, your place in the revolution might be making some really bomb t-shirts, but those t-shirts were effective, at like getting the message out and maybe raising money for folks who need money in our communities, for whether that be bailouts, whether that be for lawyers, because we don't all have access to great, lawyers that can help us out, especially when we think about how Black folks are treated in the law enforcement system. So just being able to understand that, like, find your role, and like what works for you in a way that you are able to give, to the general big picture message overall.
Yeah. So beautiful, both of you. Thank you. We've filled our time so quickly and easily, and had so many other things that we thought we might talk about, which is totally fine. We don't need to, but the thing that I would love, I don't want to part without asking, in addition to the types of things you've already both been talking about, are there any other things that you feel like, whether it's personally or like in your training, in the work that you do, how do we heal? How do we heal the racial trauma that we all are carrying? I know it's really, really big. It doesn't have to be a perfect and, oh, here's the recipe. Obviously that's silly. But are there any other types of things that come to mind? Does anything else come to mind that you want to share about that?
I would like to first acknowledge that healing is very different for, again, like similar to trauma, similar to intersections, similar to a lot of the other wonderful things we've had time to talk about today. dealing or healing, excuse me, I should say, with everything that's going on is very different for different people. And so acknowledging that for some people, healing might look real solitary. For some people, healing might be within community, if that means you need to find your people. For some people, healing might mean spending time in a library and reading books to educate yourself on like things that you once thought were true that might not be so factual now. Healing also takes time, and understanding that like healing is not linear, and that doesn't mean that like it's ever going to stop. There's no end point to it. We're constantly harming each other and having to repair all the time. And so being able to heal from those things that happen, it's not just what we see on the TV, but also our interpersonal, conversations. If someone does something that's, microaggressing, for example, that's constantly something to heal from, because it's something that happens. It's something that children do to each other without even realizing that they're doing it. And so having to come to a place where you can heal from what that feels like, what that experience was like, I think is moment to moment. And it definitely requires, excuse me, it definitely requires patience, because while we're healing, we're also still dealing with things that are very traumatic. I have been spending some time healing from March, but we're also dealing with things that are happening right now in this time and place that I might have to take some time to heal from in December. And so just being mindful that what those things might be, who those people might be, will be very different. But yeah, that's where my mind first went when you asked that question.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think that healing, the recipe is 1 cup of love, 2 teaspoons of
Do it.
2 teaspoons of sharing the mic. No, I'm playing. But I think the healing process is so important, and it looks so different. And I'll probably, reiterate a lot of things that Cassity has already said. But I think remembering to take time. I think I say that a lot of times when I'm talking to my students. But the time part is so important, because if you rush a certain part, you'll have to come back and heal that part again. And it's kind of like trying to rush like a sprained ankle. I'm going to use that because I just sprained my ankle like last month. And what I did was I was supposed to use my crutches for a certain amount of time. And I said, you know what? I don't need these. And I just hopped off of them, right? And now my ankle's still swollen, still hurts from time to time because I didn't heal. And I didn't take the time that I needed to heal. I rushed the process. And so don't be afraid to not rush, to take time, to have your days where it's like, and I think especially with everything going on with COVID, you have days where it's like, one day I'm feeling really great, right? Like in March, it was such a roller coaster, because it was like, one day I feel really great. The next day I'm really sad. The next day I'm confused. And I'll never forget, one day we were doing team check-ins, and my supervisor was like, how are you feeling? And I'm like, I'm cloudy with a chance of meatballs. I was just making it up. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm confused. And I'm just in this place where it's like, I need something to laugh about, but I also don't want to think about what's going on. There's too much going on. What's going on, right? And so I had to really step back and say, I'm not okay with what's going on. I'm hurting. This is not okay. And acknowledge that and sit in that sometimes. And I think, we're so programmed to, when somebody sees you, how are you doing? I'm fine. I'm good. I'm doing great. And those are our natural responses. And you don't have to tell people you're not doing well, but to really acknowledge, no, today I'm not doing okay. And I think to really acknowledge that is so important in the healing process, because you don't push when you don't need to. You don't have to like power through. And speaking as a woman of color, I know a lot of times people say, well, you have to be a strong Black woman, or a strong Black man, or a strong Black person. In general, we always have this, like, you have to be strong, and even when you're going through something, someone will tell you, be strong. You'll be okay. Be strong. And I think an important part of healing is understanding every day I'm not going to be strong. And that's okay too. And when we really take the time to understand that, I think that's when you have your good days, you can dance in the rain, right? You can do whatever because today is a good day and I'm living in that and I'm loving that. But when I'm not having my good day, leave me alone. I'm going to watch my Netflix, eat my ice cream, and that's what it is. And that's all part of healing. So there's no recipe. There's no formula. There's no perfect. You can talk to whoever you want to talk to Oprah, whoever. But that person's way that they learned how to heal will always be different from yours. And embrace how unique your healing process is. And don't rush. And I think that's just so important, the time.
And if it's okay, I just wanted to add something that Jovan kind of mentioned when she was talking, to add on to what Jovan mentioned, that it's going to be messy getting out of this. Like, when we think about how long Western civilization has been, in throes with just injustice and kind of just how we've done things, it's going to take time to undo. Not that we can undo it, not that we can't, that we can take it back and that it hasn't happened. But when Jovan, especially when she mentioned, talking to the youth, it's going to take time. It's going to be messy. It's going to hurt. It is going to be incredibly uncomfortable. Growing pains, and I think having to make room for that. And I think that speaks to a lot of having days where you feel cloudy with a chance of meatballs, having days where you do feel great, and also recognizing that days where you do stay in bed and maybe you are feeling a little lower are also days of strength too. Strength doesn't just have to look like pushing. Doesn't have to always look so malefic or aggressive, or just this idea of physically being, in motion and always having something done. Sometimes strength can look passive, and sometimes strength can look slower, and that also be okay too. So just this understanding that, like, it's not, like Jovan said, it's not just one recipe. It's not just one person that's got it down. It definitely is going to take time to navigate through all of those differences. When we think about all of the different people that live in this world, it's going to take time to navigate all that. So,
and if I can throw one thing in, it takes time to learn some new ways of relating, of having relationship. Like when you were talking about how kids, enact microaggressions without even knowing it, and like that the key there is learning the repair. And that made me think about resilience, and it made me think about the little changes in our relationships, you know, between Black and white people and everybody else. But if there can be experiences of those, it's like that ouch, oops, oh idea of, if there can be mistakes and repair, then there can be change and more resilience. And I understand what you're both talking about in terms of the time that this takes. I'm going to, in the page for this episode, I'm going to link to a couple resources that white people can use. I mean, anybody could use, but especially with white folks in mind, because I know one of the amazing parts of the uprising this summer was the level of white engagement and self-educating and recognizing that it's a job that we need to be doing ourselves. So, because I think part of my understanding of my job as a white person to heal the racial trauma that, I guess I don't want to use that phrase necessarily. I'm not trying to equate what I experience with what people of color experience in terms of trauma, but just to say that this impacts all of us and our humanity. So one of the things that I'm thinking about is just all those little interrelating moments. And, a question I wanted to ask you both, if you have any thoughts. One of you, I think it was Jovan, mentioned the creating of brave spaces. And I heard certain qualities of acceptance in there, you know, like it's okay to try things, or it's okay to risk. And the part of what is brave is taking those risks. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about um, ways that we can foster moments of trying things. You know, like this was trying things, but you know, between me and people that I already know and have already these wonderful connections with through the work we already did together. Do you understand what I'm trying to ask? I'm okay, great, then I'll shut up.
I mean, granted, one of my coworkers actually mentions this all the time, that practice with the small things is practice for the big things. So spending time working on those minuscule things in your interpersonal relationships are ultimately, big picture, the way that we can one day hopefully imagine to interact with one another. So when I think about white folks and what small things, it's a small thing like maybe not crossing the street every time you see a person of color, you know, or even smaller than that is working on self-thoughts that you have when encountering folks of color. Because sometimes it's not just about action. Sometimes it could be both, you know, depending on which order. Again, healing isn't linear, but sometimes it's just about thought. What are you associating with folks of color? Why? You know, when you see a Black person, what are the things that you're thinking about? Why? Where do those come from? And I think even starting there, just being able to question the things that you've been taught, the things that you've learned over time is an important aspect to doing those smaller things. So even before you get to action, because for a lot of people, especially when we think about white allyship, it can feel performative, even if it's well-intended and the person who's doing it is great. A lot of it can sometimes feel performative because of the height of, you know, just of where we are in social injustice. So just being mindful of the small things that you can, holding a door for a person that you probably wouldn't hold a door for, volunteering in a space that you normally wouldn't volunteer in, small things. I think starting out in those small ways where, like, maybe I can't risk having a very vulnerable conversation with the person of color about things that I might have done that might have hurt them or that might have harmed them or their community. But I can risk questioning myself a little bit and the things that I've learned growing up, the things that maybe my parents have taught me or that TV has taught me. You can spend some of that riskier time, because that's also deep work too, spending time with yourself and being able to acknowledge that, like, maybe some of the things I learned weren't so great. Maybe some of the ways that I think about or treat other folks that don't look like me are not great. Maybe some of the places I donate my money to are not great, you know, towards folks of color or Black people. So I think starting with the small actions that you feel like you are able to do that might not necessarily involve other folks would be a great place to start.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is just be real with yourself. Be real with everything that you're doing. If you don't think it's for you right now, or maybe you want to continue to educate yourself around something, then do the research. You know, educate yourself. Education is continual. And I think also take the time to use the resources and talk with the people that are in your circle already. So if you do feel you're ready to have these kind of conversations, start with the people that are in your circle. And also self-care at all times with these kind of things, right? You might start having these conversations, they might get heated, or the person just might not agree with anything that you're saying. And take the time to step back and say, okay, well, you know, this is too much for me at this time. Can we revisit it or not at all? But I think being real with yourself and what you're capable of and what you know you can handle is really important. And sometimes you don't know. And so that's why I did bring up the self-care piece. Just when that ouch, oops, oh, right? When that does happen, taking the time to reflect and think and learn and to grow. I think if your objective is to always grow and to learn, then you can go far, right? Keeping that open mind that, like Cassity said, maybe some things we learned we didn't like, and now we need to unlearn them or learn differently. And that's always important, and that is a part of learning. And I think Erykah Badu said it best in her song. She said, a man that knows something knows that he knows nothing at all, right? And so that we're always learning and unlearning and relearning, and that's what we do as human beings.
Love it. Jovan, you always like have these deep insights. Thank you. And you too, Cassity. I'm just bowled over. Thank you for such a beautiful conversation. Two beautiful humans.
No problem. I enjoy all the time when we do these things.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, that is it for today. I want to invite people to tune in next week and every week for more ideas that may help with the needs of now, whether you're a survivor, an ally, or anyone experiencing stress and trauma in these times. In the meantime, you can catch up on the episodes and extras from our first and second seasons, including A Love Thing, featuring Cassity and Jovan. Please subscribe to our HealMeToo podcast and festival YouTube channel, as well as on Apple Podcasts. And if you take just a second to give us a rating and review on iTunes, we love seeing the comments, and you will help more survivors and allies to find us. You can join our mailing list at HealMeTooPodcast.com to hear about future festival pop-up events on Zoom, and follow us on social media. We are at HealMeTooFest. I hope you'll say hi in the comments. Thank you for listening.